An admiral bets a 12-year-old girl can't start an F-22 Raptor. He's smirking. The crowd is laughing until she steps into the cockpit. What happens next silences an entire airbase. Then he spots something on her finger. A Naval Academy ring. Old, worn, and impossible for a child to have. His expression shifts from arrogance to shock. Suddenly, this isn't just a bet. It's something much bigger. The girl knows things she shouldn't. She moves like someone who's been here before. And as questions rise, so does the tension. Who is she really? And why does it feel like this moment is about to change everything? Before we begin, send a quick wave in the comments. Tell me your city, your country, your vibe. It's amazing how stories like this echo across the world. The morning sun stretched over the tarmac at Nellis Air Force Base, warming the concrete with its early light as 12-year-old Cassandra Brown stepped off the visitor's shuttle. Her small fingers wrapped tightly around her father's Naval Academy class ring, which hung from a simple silver chain around her neck. The metal felt warm against her skin, just like it had every day since her mother had given it to her after her father's death 3 years ago. Cass stood straighter, pulling her dark ponytail tighter as she watched other kids her age tumble excitedly off the bus, their chatter filling the crisp morning air. Unlike them, she remained quiet, taking in every detail of the military base with serious brown eyes. This wasn't just another field trip for her. This was her father's world. All future aviators participants, please gather by the blue cone. A cheerful program coordinator waved a clipboard in the air, trying to organize the group of 30 children into some kind of order. Cass moved carefully through the crowd, her worn backpack containing carefully studied flight manuals bumping against her shoulder. She'd spent countless hours poring over her father's old books, tracing his handwritten notes in the margins with her fingertips, trying to understand the world that had meant so much to him. From his office window overlooking the airfield, Admiral William Garrett watched the gathering crowd with barely concealed irritation. His weathered face, marked by decades of military service, settled into familiar lines of disapproval. The Future Aviators program was, in his opinion, nothing more than a public relations stunt, a way to make the Air Force seem friendly and accessible to civilians who couldn't possibly understand the gravity of military service. Another year, another dog and pony show, he muttered, straightening his already impeccable uniform. His silver-gray hair caught the morning light as he turned to his aide. Remind me again why we waste resources on this? Sir, it's excellent for community relations, the young lieutenant replied carefully, and Secretary Wilson specifically requested we continue the program. Garrett's stern posture didn't waver. In my day, we didn't need to entertain children to maintain our standing in the community. Respect was earned through service and sacrifice, not field trips. Down on the tarmac, Cass found herself at the edge of the group, observing how the other kids seemed to treat this like a trip to an amusement park. Her calloused hands, earned from hours of working with her own cobbled-together flight simulator at home, absently reached for her father's ring again. Commander Thomas Brown's warm smile flashed in her memory, the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners when he'd explain flight principles to her, even when she was too young to fully understand. The coordinator began dividing the children into smaller groups, and Cass listened intently as they were given their schedule for the day. Each word was carefully stored away, just as she'd stored away every scrap of aviation knowledge she could find since her father's death. Admiral Garrett made his way down to the tarmac, his presence causing an immediate ripple of attention among the base personnel. He stood rigid and imposing, watching as the children were organized into their groups. His eyes swept over them dismissively until they landed on Cass, and something in her serious demeanor made him pause. Unlike the other children who fidgeted and chatted, she stood with an almost military bearing, her attention focused completely on the briefing. The glint of metal at her neck caught his eye, a class ring that seemed strangely familiar. For a moment, his carefully maintained expression faltered. There was something about the girl that nudged at his memory, something in the way she carried herself that seemed out of place among the excited children around her. But he quickly dismissed the thought, returning to his usual stern demeanor. "Let's get this over with," he said to no one in particular, his voice carrying the weight of command that had become second nature over his long career. Cass heard his words and turned slightly, catching the Admiral's eye for just a moment. In that brief exchange, something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, of the military bearing they both carried, though for very different reasons. She saw in him the same rigid dedication her father had embodied, while he saw in her something that didn't fit his predetermined notion of what these civilian children represented. The moment passed quickly as the coordinator began moving the groups toward their first activities. Cass fell into step with her assigned team, her father's ring bouncing lightly against her chest with each step. Behind her, Admiral Garrett watched the groups disperse, his usual disdain for the program temporarily displaced by an unexpected curiosity about the serious young girl with the familiar ring. The static display area of Nellis Air Force Base gleamed under the late morning sun. The crown jewel of the exhibition, an F-22 Raptor, stood proudly at the center, its sleek lines and advanced design drawing admiring gasps from the visiting children. While most kids clustered together taking selfies with the aircraft in the background, Cassandra Brown broke away from her group, moving with deliberate steps toward the fighter jet. Her eyes traced every curve and angle of the aircraft with the kind of attention usually reserved for seasoned pilots. Her small hands reached up to touch her father's ring as she approached, a habit that had become as natural as breathing. The other children's excitement had already begun to fade as they drifted toward the snack tables, but Cass remained transfixed. Admiral Garrett, who had been observing the tour from a short distance, noticed her intense focus. His weathered face creased with annoyance as he watched her step closer to the multi-million-dollar aircraft. Something about her deliberate movements and serious expression struck him as presumptuous, and he felt the familiar urge to put civilian enthusiasm in its proper place. "Young lady," he called out, his commanding voice causing several nearby staff members to snap to attention. "You seem quite interested in our F-22. Cass turned to face him, her expression composed despite the authority in his voice. "Yes, sir," she replied simply, her fingers still wrapped around the ring at her neck. The Admiral's lips curved into a slight smirk as he noticed the gathering crowd of children and staff. This would be an excellent opportunity to demonstrate the true complexity of military aviation to these civilians, who thought a few hours at an air base made them experts. "Tell me," he said, his voice carrying a mock friendliness that made several airmen exchange uncomfortable glances. "Since you're studying our aircraft so intently, perhaps you'd like to show us how to start it up?" A murmur ran through the growing crowd. The other children, sensing drama, abandoned their snacks and gathered around. Even the program coordinator stepped forward, looking concerned. "Sir," she began, "the schedule calls for—" Admiral Garrett held up his hand, silencing her. "I'll make you a deal," he continued, addressing Cass directly. "If you can correctly demonstrate the engine start sequence for this aircraft, I'll personally give you a full tour of the base." His smile grew harder. "But when you fail, you'll have learned a valuable lesson about respecting military expertise." The crowd of children whispered excitedly. A few of the pilots exchanged knowing looks. The F-22's startup sequence was notoriously complex, requiring extensive training and certification. To them, this was clearly meant to be a teaching moment about military complexity. Cass stood quietly for a moment, her serious brown eyes meeting the Admiral's challenging gaze. Then, without a word, she turned toward the aircraft's cockpit. A senior pilot stepped forward to assist her up the access ladder, more out of ingrained courtesy than expectation. The Admiral's smile remained fixed as he watched her settle into the cockpit. He could see her small hands hovering over the controls, and for a brief moment, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. There was something about her methodical movements that seemed oddly familiar. The gathered crowd grew silent as Cass's hands began to move across the control panel. Her movements were neither hurried nor hesitant, but displayed a surprising confidence that caught the attention of the experienced pilots watching below. Their professional interest began to replace their initial amusement as they watched her fingers trace the exact patterns they themselves had learned through countless hours of training. Admiral Garrett's smirk gradually faded as he observed her movements. The sequence she was demonstrating wasn't just approximate. It was precise. His rigid posture stiffened further as he watched her small hands move from switch to switch, panel to panel, in the exact order that had been drilled into thousands of pilots over years of training. The whispers among the crowd changed tone. The other children, who had expected entertainment, now watched in confused silence. The pilots had stopped smiling entirely, their expressions shifting to professional interest and growing surprise. "Sir," one of the senior pilots said quietly to the Admiral, She's actually following the correct sequence." Garrett didn't respond, his eyes fixed on Cass's movements. The girl's face showed intense concentration as she continued through the procedure, her hands moving with the kind of familiarity that couldn't come from mere chance or casual observation. The tension in the air grew thicker as she progressed through the sequence, each correct movement adding to the mounting disbelief among the professional aviators present. What had started as a moment of intended humiliation was transforming into something entirely unexpected, drawing more and more base personnel to the growing crowd around the F-22. Cass remained focused, seemingly oblivious to the stir she was creating. Her father's ring glinted in the sunlight as she worked, catching the Admiral's eye once again. Something about that ring, combined with the precision of her movements, began to stir an uncomfortable memory in the back of his mind. The cockpit of the F-22 hummed with latent power as Cass's hands continued their precise dance across the control panel. Her movements were deliberate and confident, each switch and dial manipulated in perfect sequence. The gathered crowd below held their collective breath, the earlier mockery forgotten in the face of what they were witnessing. With practiced precision, Cass engaged the auxiliary power unit. The characteristic whine of the system spinning up cut through the desert air, causing several of the veteran pilots to exchange wide-eyed glances. This wasn't just a child playing pretend, she was executing the actual startup sequence with textbook accuracy. "That's impossible," muttered one of the senior pilots, his voice barely audible over the growing whine of the machinery. "She just engaged the APU perfectly." Admiral Garrett's face had lost all trace of its earlier condescension. His weathered features now showed a mix of disbelief and growing concern as he watched the girl's small hands move across the cockpit with unmistakable familiarity. The ring around her neck caught the sunlight again, and this time, the glint sent a jolt of recognition through him that he couldn't quite place. The other children, who had gathered expecting to see their peer embarrassed, now pressed forward with genuine amazement. Their earlier giggles and whispers had given way to awed silence as they witnessed something extraordinary unfolding before them. Cass remained focused, her serious brown eyes scanning the instruments with practiced ease. Her fingers found each switch and button without hesitation, moving through the complex sequence, as if she had done it 1,000 times before. The sound of the auxiliary power unit reached its proper pitch, and she smoothly transitioned to the next phase of the startup procedure. "Sir," one of the maintenance chiefs spoke up, his voice tight with astonishment. "She's following the exact sequence, not a single step out of place." The Admiral didn't respond, his eyes fixed on Cass's movements with growing intensity. The dismissive attitude he had worn like armor was cracking, replaced by an uncomfortable sensation he couldn't quite name. Something about her precision, the way she handled the aircraft systems, tickled at the edges of his memory. The moment of truth arrived as Cass initiated the main engine start sequence. The massive turbine engine began its characteristic spool-up, the sound building from a low whine to a powerful roar that echoed across the display area. The F-22's engine came to life under her guidance, its thrust sending small eddies of dust swirling across the tarmac. A collective gasp went up from the crowd. Even the most skeptical observers couldn't deny what they were seeing. A 12-year-old girl had just successfully started one of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. The pilots in attendance stood slack-jawed, their professional composure momentarily forgotten in the face of this unprecedented display. "Complete engine startup achieved," announced one of the monitoring technicians, his voice carrying a note of stunned respect. "All parameters normal." Cass's face remained composed as she began the shutdown sequence, her movements just as precise and confident as during the startup. There was no triumph in her expression, no hint of satisfaction at proving her doubters wrong. She handled the aircraft with a reverence that spoke of deep understanding rather than mere memorization. Admiral Garrett stood rooted to the spot, his military bearing momentarily forgotten as he processed what he had just witnessed. The girl's knowledge went far beyond what any civilian child could have picked up from movies or video games. This was intimate, practical knowledge of complex military systems, the kind that only came from serious study and training. The other children burst into excited chatter as Cass completed the shutdown sequence. Their earlier skepticism transformed into unbridled admiration. The base personnel present maintained their professional demeanor, but their expressions betrayed their amazement at what they had just witnessed. As Cass prepared to exit the cockpit, her hand unconsciously reached for her father's ring again. The gesture caught Admiral Garrett's attention, and suddenly the memory he had been grasping at snapped into focus. He had seen that ring before, years ago, on another hand that had demonstrated the same precise skill in a cockpit. The maintenance chief helped Cass down from the aircraft, and she stood quietly before the gathered crowd, her small frame somehow seeming larger now. The other children surged forward, pelting her with excited questions, while the military personnel maintained their distance, still processing what they had just witnessed. Admiral Garrett stepped forward, his earlier smugness replaced by an intensity that silenced the chattering children. He looked at Cass with new eyes, seeing beyond the small 12-year-old to something that demanded his full attention. The demonstration he had intended as a lesson in humility had instead become a revelation that would shake his carefully ordered world. Admiral Garrett stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the ring that hung from the chain around Cass's neck. The sunlight caught the polished surface, revealing the familiar engravings he had seen countless times before. Class of 2003, United States Naval Academy. His heart seemed to stop as the memories crashed over him like a tidal wave. "Tom's ring," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the idle chatter of the crowd. The world around him faded as his mind catapulted back 3 years. He could see Tom Brown's face as clearly as if it were yesterday. That easy smile that never quite reached his serious eyes when they were on mission. They had flown together so many times, trusted each other with their lives on countless occasions. The memory of their last flight together rose unbidden, sharp and painful. The dark clouds, the radio crackle, Tom's steady voice coming through his headset. "I've got your 6, Bill. Always will." Those were the last words Garrett had heard from his friend before everything went wrong. The mission had gone sideways. Their aircraft caught in a trap none of them had seen coming. When the enemy fire had concentrated on Garrett's plane, Tom had done what he always did, put himself between his wingman and danger. Garrett's hands trembled slightly as he watched Cass methodically power down the F-22. Her movements were so familiar it made his chest ache. She had her father's precision, his unwavering focus. Tom had moved through cockpit procedures the same way, with that same quiet confidence. "Sir?" A junior officer approached, clipboard in hand. "Should we—" Garrett waved him off, unable to tear his eyes away from the girl. How had he not seen it before? The serious expression, the careful way she handled the aircraft's controls. She was Tom's daughter through and through. The realization hit him with physical force, making him take a step back. The memories continued to flood in. Tom showing him pictures of little Cassandra in his ready room, proud father that he was. "She's got the bug already, Bill," he had said, beaming. "Caught her reading my flight manuals last week. She's going to be a better pilot than both of us someday." The guilt that Garrett had carried for 3 years rose up, threatening to choke him. He should have been the one to make that sacrifice. Tom had a family, a daughter who needed him. But Tom had made the choice, had given his life to ensure his wingman made it home. And Garrett had repaid that sacrifice by becoming bitter, by nearly humiliating Tom's daughter in front of everyone. In the cockpit, Cass continued her shutdown sequence, each movement a mirror of her father's technique. She was completely absorbed in her task, unaware of the emotional storm she had unleashed in the hardened Admiral. Her small hands moved across the controls with the same certainty Tom's had shown countless times during their years flying together. The crowd's excited murmurs faded to background noise as Garrett watched her. He remembered the official notification, the classified details that could never be shared with Tom's family. The weight of those secrets, combined with the burden of survivor's guilt, had turned him into someone he barely recognized, someone Tom would have been disappointed to see. As Cass finished the shutdown procedure, Garrett noticed her unconsciously reaching for her father's ring again, just as Tom used to do when deep in thought. The simple gesture sent another wave of recognition through him. How many times had he seen his friend do exactly that during mission briefings, or while working through a difficult problem? The maintenance chief helped Cass down from the aircraft, and she stood quietly before the gathered crowd. The other children swarmed around her, firing questions and exclamations, but she maintained her father's characteristic calm. She answered their questions with quiet dignity, another trait that was pure Tom Brown. Garrett remained rooted to his spot, overwhelmed by the confluence of past and present. The demonstration that he had intended as a lesson in humility had instead become a harsh mirror, showing him how far he had strayed from the man Tom had been proud to call his friend. The ghost of his last conversation with Tom echoed in his mind. Their shared jokes, their plans for future missions, all cut short by fate and enemy fire. The ring caught the sunlight once more as Cass turned, and Garrett felt the weight of his friend's sacrifice anew. Tom had given everything to ensure he would make it home that day, and here was his legacy: a 12-year-old girl with her father's spirit and skill, standing on an Air Force flight line as if she belonged there. Which Garrett now realized she absolutely did. Colonel Bella Martinez strode into the conference room, her polished boots clicking against the tile floor, her dark eyes fixed on Cassandra Brown, who sat alone at the large table. Still wearing her father's ring on the chain around her neck, 2 armed security personnel stood by the door, a clear sign this was no casual conversation. "Miss Brown," Martinez said, setting down a thick folder and taking a seat across from Cass, "I need you to explain exactly how you obtained knowledge of classified flight systems." Her tone was crisp, professional, but held an edge of suspicion that made the room feel colder. Cass looked up, her expression calm despite the intimidating situation. "I learned from my dad's books and materials," she said simply. "After he died, I found his old flight manuals and training guides in boxes in our attic." Martinez's eyebrows drew together. "You expect me to believe a 12-year-old taught herself complex military aircraft operations from old manuals?" "Yes, ma'am." Cass's voice remained steady. "I've been studying them every day for 3 years. It was a way to feel close to my dad." Outside the conference room, Admiral Garrett watched through the observation window, his jaw tight with concern. He could see Tom in every aspect of Cass's composure, the way she sat straight-backed in her chair, how she met Martinez's gaze without flinching. "These materials you mentioned," Martinez continued, opening her folder, "they would have contained classified information, restricted technical specifications, access protocols that civilians aren't authorized to possess." She leaned forward. "Do you understand the seriousness of this situation?" Before Cass could respond, the door opened and Admiral Garrett stepped in. Martinez stood immediately, but her expression showed clear annoyance at the interruption. "Colonel," Garrett said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "A word, please." In the hallway, Martinez didn't bother hiding her frustration. "Sir, with all due respect, this is a serious security breach. That girl has somehow accessed highly classified systems knowledge. It's my job to find out how and ensure there hasn't been a wider compromise." Garrett's weathered face remained stern. "I understand your concerns, Colonel, but she's a 12-year-old who found her dead father's training materials. This isn't some foreign intelligence operation." "The regulations are clear, Admiral," Martinez pressed. "Unauthorized access to classified information must be investigated. regardless of the circumstances or the age of the individual involved. She held up a hand to forestall his objection. And her age makes this more concerning, not less. Someone could be using her as a cover. Garrett felt his protective instincts surge. The thought of Tom's daughter being treated like a security threat made his blood boil, but he knew Martinez was technically correct. The regulations were indeed clear. "I knew her father," he said finally, his voice low. "Commander Thomas Brown. He died saving my life 3 years ago on a classified operation. That girl in there isn't a security risk. She's a daughter trying to hold on to her father's memory the only way she knows how." Martinez's expression softened slightly, but her resolve didn't waver. "I'm sympathetic to her situation, sir, but that doesn't change the facts. She has knowledge she shouldn't have. Knowledge that could compromise operational security? I have to investigate." Through the window, they could see Cass sitting quietly, her small hands folded on the table. She looked impossibly young in the stark conference room, yet carried herself with a dignity beyond her years. "How do you want to proceed?" Garrett asked, knowing he couldn't simply shut down the investigation without raising even more red flags. "I need to conduct a full review of these materials she mentioned," Martinez replied. "Interview her mother, document everything she's had access to, and—" She hesitated. "We'll need to assess whether any charges are warranted." "Charges?" Garrett's voice rose sharply. "She's a child, Colonel." "Which is why she likely wouldn't face serious consequences," Martinez assured him. "But we have to follow procedure. You know that, sir?" Garrett watched as Martinez returned to the conference room. His chest felt tight as he observed Cass answering questions about her father's belongings, about how she'd studied the manuals late at night, about her determination to understand the world her father had lived in. The investigation was necessary. He knew that. But watching Tom's daughter face scrutiny for trying to honor her father's memory felt like failing his friend all over again. He had survived because of Tom's sacrifice, and now he stood by while Tom's daughter was treated like a security threat. Martinez's voice drifted through the door as she continued her questioning. "We'll need you to turn over all materials related to military aircraft or operations. Any books, manuals, or documents that belong to your father? Do you understand?" Cass nodded, her composure finally cracking slightly as she realized she would have to give up her last connections to her father's world. The sight made Garrett's heart ache. He had to find a way to protect her while satisfying the security requirements. He owed Tom that much. Colonel Martinez's fingers flew across her keyboard, her face illuminated by the glow of multiple monitors in the darkened office. What had started as a routine security check into Cassandra Brown's flight knowledge had led her down an unexpected path. "This can't be right," she muttered, leaning closer to the screen. The logs showed repeated access to classified military databases over the past 3 years, all through Commander Thomas Brown's credentials. The account should have been deactivated after his death. She pulled up another window, tracking the digital footprint. The access points all traced back to the Brown residence, specifically late-night hours when most 12-year-olds would be asleep. Cass hadn't just been reading her father's old manuals. She'd been exploring restricted military systems using his login information. In the adjacent office, Admiral Garrett was reviewing the preliminary findings when Martinez burst through his door, her usual composure shaken. "Sir, you need to see this," she said, placing her laptop on his desk. "The girl hasn't just been studying old manuals. She's been accessing current military databases using her father's credentials." Garrett's face darkened. "That's impossible. Those accounts are terminated immediately upon death notification." "Apparently not this one," Martinez replied, turning the screen toward him. "But that's not the most concerning part. Look at the files she accessed." Garrett leaned forward, his eyes scanning the data. Most of the access logs showed searches related to flight systems and training protocols. Exactly what you'd expect from a child trying to learn about flying. But scattered among them were fragments of classified communications, mission reports, and encrypted messages from the weeks leading up to Commander Brown's death. She was looking for information about her father, Martinez explained, scrolling through the logs. But she accidentally stumbled onto something much bigger. Look at these communications. The messages revealed a pattern of suspicious transfers, coded references to military technology sales, and correspondence between high-ranking officials that made no sense for their roles. All of it centered around the time period just before Thomas Brown's final mission. Garrett's blood ran cold as the pieces started falling into place. Tom wasn't killed in a routine mission, was he? He said quietly. He found out about this. Whatever this is. Martinez nodded grimly. It looks like certain officials were selling classified military information to foreign interests. Commander Brown must have discovered the operation. She pulled up another file. His death was logged as a training accident, but these communications suggest it was deliberately orchestrated. And now his daughter has unknowingly accessed the evidence, Garrett said, his voice heavy with realization. Does she understand what she's found? I don't think so, Martinez replied. Her search patterns suggest she was focused on technical information about aircraft and missions. She probably didn't recognize the significance of these other files. She paused, her expression grave. But someone else has noticed her activities. There's been increased traffic monitoring this account in the past 24 hours. After her demonstration with the F-22, she drew attention to herself. Garrett stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Where is she now? In protective custody, sir. I moved her to secure quarters as soon as I discovered the database access. Martinez closed her laptop. But if she really has stumbled onto evidence of a conspiracy that got her father killed, then she's in danger, Garrett finished. He reached for his phone, then stopped, realizing they had no way of knowing who they could trust. The conspiracy had reached high enough to arrange a decorated commander's murder and cover it up. How deep did it really go? Sir, Martinez said carefully, this changes everything. What started as a security investigation into unauthorized access has uncovered something much more serious. We're not just dealing with a 12-year-old who learned to fly. We're looking at high-level treason and murder. Garrett moved to the window, looking out at the darkening base. Somewhere out there, Tom's daughter sat in a secure room, unaware that her innocent attempts to connect with her father's memory had placed her squarely in the crosshairs of the same people who had killed him. Pull everything you can from those databases, he ordered, before someone realizes we've found it and starts deleting evidence. And Colonel? He turned back to Martinez, his face set with determination. Not a word of this to anyone else. We don't know who we can trust. Martinez nodded, gathering her materials. What about Cassandra? I made a promise to her father, even if he never heard it, Garrett said firmly. I won't fail to protect his daughter the way I failed to protect him. As Martinez left his office, Garrett picked up the framed photograph on his desk, himself and Tom Brown, standing in front of their aircraft, both smiling, unaware of what the future held. I'm so sorry, old friend, he whispered, but I swear I'll keep her safe and expose the truth, whatever it takes. The shrill sound of the base's lockdown alarm pierced the evening air. Cass sat up from her cot in the secure quarters, something feeling off about the timing. She'd memorized the base's drill schedules from her father's documents. There wasn't supposed to be an exercise tonight. Through the narrow window of her room, she noticed armed figures moving with purpose across the darkened grounds, not the usual security patrol patterns she'd observed earlier. Her heart began to race as she recognized the deliberate way they were positioning themselves. These weren't regular base security personnel conducting a drill. The door lock clicked, and Cass's instincts screamed danger. Without hesitation, she wedged a chair under the handle and scrambled to the air vent she'd noticed earlier. Years of working with her father's tools had given her small hands surprising strength as she quickly loosened the screws. Voices approached outside. Check in here. Make it look like an accident. Cass pulled herself into the ventilation shaft just as the door burst open. Through the metal grating, she watched two men in Air Force uniforms enter, their movements precise and predatory. These weren't regular airmen. They moved like the special operations personnel she'd read about in her father's files. "The girl's gone," one of them growled into a radio. "Sweep the building." Cass began crawling through the ventilation system, grateful for her small size. Her mind raced through the base layout she'd studied so obsessively. The nearest exit would take her toward the training hangars, where the T-6 Texan training aircraft were kept. In his office, Admiral Garrett was reviewing security footage when his phone buzzed. A text from Colonel Martinez: "Hostile elements active. Protect the girl." His blood ran cold as he watched the security feeds showing armed men converging on Cass's quarters. This wasn't a drill. It was an assassination attempt disguised as a security exercise. He grabbed his sidearm and ran for the door, knowing exactly where a child who could fly would go. Cass emerged from the ventilation system behind the training hangar, her heart pounding. The night air was cool against her face as she crouched in the shadows, watching the patrol patterns. 3 years of studying military protocols was about to pay off. She knew there would be a gap in coverage during shift changes, even during a lockdown. When the moment came, she sprinted across the tarmac to the nearest T-6. Her hands trembled as she picked the lock on the canopy. Another skill learned from lonely afternoons, practicing with her father's old tools. The cockpit felt both familiar and alien as she slipped inside. She'd done this thousands of times in simulators, but never with real controls under her fingers. The sound of approaching vehicles spurred her into action. Her fingers flew across the switches and controls, muscle memory from countless hours of practice taking over. The engine roared to life just as flashlight beams swept across the hangar. "Stop that aircraft," a voice commanded over the base-wide speaker system. "This is not a drill. Shut down immediately." Cass engaged the throttle, the training aircraft lurching forward. Bullets pinged off the fuselage as she taxied toward the runway, her heart in her throat. This was nothing like the simulators. This was terrifyingly real. Admiral Garrett reached the flight line just in time to see the T-6 taking off. Pursued by base security vehicles, he sprinted to the nearest ready aircraft. An F-16 Fighting Falcon kept prepared for quick reaction alerts. Within minutes, he was airborne, following the training aircraft's radar signature. "Nellis Tower, this is Admiral Garrett," he radioed. "That aircraft is under my protection. Anyone who engages will answer directly to me." In the T-6, Cass fought to steady her breathing as she climbed through 3,000 feet. The aircraft responded differently than the simulators. Heavier, more alive. Warning indicators flashed as radar signatures appeared behind her. Multiple aircraft in pursuit. "Cassandra, this is Admiral Garrett," a familiar voice crackled over her radio. "I know why they're after you. Your father discovered something dangerous, and now you have too. I'm here to protect you, but you need to trust me." Cass's hands tightened on the controls. How can I trust anyone? They killed my father? "Because I was there when he died," Garrett's voice softened. "He saved my life that day, and I failed to save his. I won't fail his daughter too. Follow my lead. I know somewhere safe." Tears blurred Cass's vision as she banked the aircraft, falling into formation with Garrett's F-16. Behind them, radar signatures showed more aircraft launching from Nellis, but Garrett's presence seemed to be keeping them at a distance. For now. "Stay close," Garrett instructed. "We're going to get you somewhere safe and expose the truth your father died trying to protect. But first, we need to survive the night." The two aircraft disappeared into the darkening sky, leaving the lights of Nellis Air Force Base behind as they flew into an uncertain future, pursued by those who would kill to keep their secrets hidden. Admiral Garrett guided his F-16 alongside Cass's training aircraft as they descended toward a small private airstrip nestled in the desert mountains. The landing lights cast long shadows across the empty runway as both aircraft touched down safely. His mind raced, connecting pieces of a puzzle that had haunted him for 3 years. As they taxied to a stop, Garrett's hands trembled on the controls. The secure tablet in his cockpit displayed classified files he'd accessed during their flight, mission reports, surveillance logs, and financial transactions that painted a devastating picture. He'd suspected corruption within the ranks, but the scope of what he now saw shook him to his core. They climbed down from their aircraft and Garrett rushed to help Cass. Her face was pale but determined in the dim light of the desert evening. "Are you all right?" he asked, checking her for injuries. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady despite everything she'd been through. "But they tried to kill me, didn't they? Just like they killed my father?" Garrett's throat tightened. "Yes," he admitted, leading her toward a small hangar. "Your father wasn't killed in a routine mission accident. He discovered something terrible, and they murdered him to keep it quiet." Inside the hangar, Garrett activated a secure computer terminal. Documents and photographs flashed across the screen. Evidence Tom had gathered before his death. "Your father found proof that several high-ranking military officials were selling classified weapon systems data to foreign powers. He was going to expose them." Cass stared at the screen, her father's Naval Academy ring glinting on her finger. "And when I accessed his old files, I found the same information without realizing what it was." "Exactly?" Garrett's voice was heavy with regret. "They've been watching for anyone accessing those files. When you started digging through the databases using your father's credentials, you triggered their security protocols. They knew they had to silence you just like they silenced him." The weight of command had never felt heavier on Garrett's shoulders. For 3 years, he'd played it safe, following orders and maintaining his position. But now, looking at Tom's daughter, this brave, brilliant child who shared her father's unwavering sense of right and wrong, he knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. "I was there on your father's last mission," Garrett revealed, his voice breaking. "We were flying together when they sabotaged his aircraft. He knew something was wrong, but instead of saving himself, he used his last moments to protect my plane from enemy fire. I've carried that guilt every day since." Cass looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You didn't kill him. They did." "Yes, but I failed him by not investigating further. I knew something wasn't right about that mission, but I was too afraid to dig deeper." Garrett's fists clenched. "I won't fail him again, and I won't fail you." The sound of distant aircraft made them both tense. Garrett checked the radar display. Multiple signatures approaching from different directions. The conspirators weren't giving up. "We can't stay here long," he said, downloading the evidence onto a secure drive. "They'll have tracked us. But now we know the truth, and we have proof." He turned to Cass, his decision made. "I've spent years protecting my career, my reputation, but your father died protecting what was right, and you've shown the same courage. It's time I did the same." "What will they do to you?" Cass asked, understanding the sacrifice he was making. "They'll try to discredit me, probably court-martial me for helping you escape." Garrett managed a grim smile. "But that doesn't matter now. What matters is exposing the truth and keeping you safe." The approaching aircraft grew louder. Garrett quickly gathered their evidence and essential supplies. "Your father died protecting more than just military secrets. He died protecting the integrity of everything we swore to defend. Now it's our turn to finish what he started." Cass stood straighter, her father's ring catching the light. "He would have wanted us to make it right." "Yes, he would." Garrett checked his weapon and survival gear. "But it won't be easy. These people have power, influence, and they've killed to keep their secrets. Are you ready for what comes next?" "I've been ready since the day he died," Cass replied, her voice firm. "I just didn't know what I was ready for until now." The sound of helicopters echoed through the mountains. Garrett and Cass shared a look of determination. both fully understanding the danger they faced and the importance of their mission. They had become unlikely allies in a fight for justice, bound together by the legacy of a man who had died protecting the truth. In the secure underground command center of Nellis Air Force Base, Admiral Garrett sat at his private terminal, carefully selecting names from personnel files. Each officer he chose had to be beyond reproach, people whose loyalty lay with honor rather than advancement. The blue light from the screen cast shadows across his weathered face as he worked through the night. Captain Sarah Chen, he muttered, adding another name to his list. 3 commendations for integrity under pressure. Turned down 2 promotions to stay with her flight crew. He knew Chen personally. She had questioned the official report about Tom's death 3 years ago. Major James Rodriguez was next. The intelligence officer had helped expose corruption in military contracts last year despite threats to his career. Then Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Wright, whose dedication to truth had cost him multiple promotions but earned him unwavering respect from his subordinates. In a secure room adjacent to his office, Cass sat curled in a large leather chair, her father's flight manuals spread around her. She had insisted on reviewing them again, looking for any notes or codes he might have left behind. The ring on her finger caught the light as she turned each page with careful precision. "Your father would be proud," Garrett said softly, watching her methodical work. "He always said the best pilots were the ones who did their homework." Cass looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "He knew they might kill him, didn't he? That's why he left all these materials where I could find them." Garrett moved to sit beside her, his usual rigid posture softening. "Your father was always thinking 10 steps ahead. He knew the risks, but he believed some things were worth dying for." He gestured to the manuals. "He also believed in preparing for every possibility, just like you've been doing all these years." Security cameras showed Captain Chen arriving at the outer checkpoint. Garrett watched her progress through the base on multiple monitors. When she entered the command center, her expression was grave but determined. "Sir," she saluted sharply, "I've assembled the team you requested. They're waiting in secure briefing room 3. Garrett nodded. "And the protective detail for Cass?" "Handpicked from my own squadron, sir. They've been swept for connections to any of the suspected conspirators." In the briefing room, Garrett faced 12 officers he trusted with his life, and more importantly, with Cass's life. The evidence was laid out on screens around them: financial transfers, doctored mission reports, surveillance footage from the day Tom died. "What we're about to undertake will put all of our careers at risk," Garrett announced, his voice firm. "Some of the people we're moving against have stars on their shoulders and friends in Washington. They've already killed to protect their secrets, and they'll do it again." He looked at each face in turn, seeing the same determination he felt. But Commander Brown died trying to expose this corruption, and his daughter nearly died for stumbling onto the same truth. "I'm not asking you to risk your lives. I'm asking you to honor your oaths." Major Rodriguez stepped forward. "We've secured communication channels they can't monitor. Wright's team has backup servers ready if they try to delete evidence. And my pilots are ready to provide air support if needed," Chen added. "We won't let them hurt the commander's daughter." Garrett felt a weight lift from his shoulders, the weight of 3 years of silence and guilt. "Then let's begin. Rodriguez, start building the case for the Justice Department. Chen, coordinate security sweeps of all access points. Wright, I want every piece of evidence backed up and distributed to secure locations." As his officers moved to their tasks, Garrett returned to check on Cass. She had fallen asleep among her father's manuals, her small form finally relaxed in exhaustion. He carefully draped his jacket over her shoulders, remembering how Tom used to talk about his brilliant daughter. "We're going to finish what your father started," he whispered, "and this time, the truth won't be buried." The next 12 hours were a blur of activity. Garrett coordinated with trusted officials in Washington, gathered supporting evidence from other bases, and established secure protocols for protecting their investigation. Each step was measured, each decision weighed against the danger it might bring to Cass. The girl woke to find herself at the center of an operation that would have impressed her father. She watched Garrett transform from the rigid, dismissive commander she'd first met into someone who reminded her of Dad, someone who put doing right above playing it safe. "They'll come after us hard when they realize what we're doing," she said, standing beside Garrett as he reviewed security feeds. He nodded, resting a protective hand on her shoulder. "Yes, they will. But this time we'll be ready for them. Your father faced them alone. We won't make that mistake again." The morning sun cast long shadows across the Nellis flight line as Cass climbed into the cockpit of the T-38 training jet. What should have been a routine combat exercise felt heavy with tension. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her flight helmet, remembering Admiral Garrett's warning. "Keep your eyes sharp," he had said. "They'll try to use the confusion of the exercise to make their move." Through her headset, she heard Garrett's voice from the control tower. "Red Team, you are cleared for takeoff. Remember, these are simulated engagements only." Cass guided her aircraft down the runway, the familiar vibration of the engines calming her nerves. As she lifted into the clear desert sky, she noticed 2 F-16s falling into formation behind her, not part of the planned exercise scenario. "Tower, this is Brown," she called, using her father's last name as her call sign. "I'm showing 2 unscheduled aircraft on my 6. Static crackled in her ears. Then Garrett's urgent voice, "Cass, those aren't friendly aircraft. Break formation now." She yanked the stick hard to the right just as a training missile, modified with live ammunition, streaked past her wing. Her father's voice seemed to whisper in her memory, "When outnumbered, use their size against them." The T-38 responded instantly to her commands, banking sharply into a tight turn that the larger F-16s couldn't match. She dropped altitude, skimming the desert floor where their radar would have trouble tracking her against the ground clutter. "Tower, I need options," she called, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Head for Sector 7, Garrett commanded. "Captain Chen's squadron is scrambling to intercept, but you need to survive for 4 minutes." 4 minutes. She could do this. She had memorized every page of her father's combat manuals, studied every technique he had documented. Now she would find out if knowledge could translate into survival. The F-16 split up, trying to trap her between them. Cass smiled grimly. They were using standard pursuit tactics, exactly what her father's notes had prepared her for. She pulled up sharply, then cut power, letting her aircraft stall and fall backward. The maneuver, perfectly executed, dropped her neatly between her pursuers, forcing them to overshoot. "That's my girl," she heard Garrett murmur over the radio. "Just like your father." But the assassins were skilled pilots. They recovered quickly, turning back toward her with deadly purpose. Another missile streaked past, close enough that Cass felt the heat of its exhaust. She pushed her smaller aircraft to its limits, using every trick she had learned from years of studying her father's materials. The T-38 screamed through a series of tight turns and rolls, each maneuver precisely calculated to waste her pursuers' energy and ammunition. 2 minutes until friendly contact, Garrett updated her. "Chen's squadron is inbound fast." Cass checked her fuel gauge. The desperate maneuvering had burned through her reserves. She wouldn't last 2 minutes in a straight chase. Then she spotted the narrow canyon ahead, the one her father had used in his famous training exercises. "Tower, I'm taking it to the canyon," she announced. "Negative." Garrett's voice was sharp with concern. "That's too dangerous at your experience level." "Trust me," Cass replied, her father's ring pressing against the flight stick. "I've studied every inch of this route." She dove into the canyon, letting muscle memory guide her through the turns she had visualized 1,000 times while reading her father's flight logs. The T-38's wings nearly brushed the rocky walls as she threaded through passages barely wider than her wingspan. Behind her, one of the F-16s pulled up, unwilling to risk the dangerous terrain. The other followed her in, but his larger aircraft couldn't match her agility in the confined space. She heard the screech of metal on rock, followed by Garrett's excited voice. "Second bandit has clipped his wing. He's pulling out." Cass emerged from the canyon to find Captain Chen's squadron arriving in force. The remaining assassin turned to flee but was quickly surrounded and forced to land. On the ground, security teams were already moving to arrest the corrupt officials who had ordered the attack. "Tower, this is Brown," she called, her voice finally shaking with delayed reaction. "Request permission to return to base." "Permission granted," Garrett replied warmly. "Bring her home, Cass. Bring her home." As she lined up for landing, Cass touched her father's ring, now warm from her grip on the controls. She had done more than survive. She had proven herself worthy of his legacy. The skills he had passed down through his careful documentation had saved her life, just as he might have hoped when he left those materials for her to find. The landing gear touched down smoothly, and Cass taxied to a stop amid a gathering crowd of cheering personnel. Through her canopy, she could see Admiral Garrett striding across the tarmac, his face bright with pride and relief. She had not only survived the assassination attempt, but had turned the tables on her attackers using everything her father had taught her through his written legacy. The aftermath of Cass's aerial escape unfolded rapidly across Nellis Air Force Base. Admiral Garrett stood in the command center, surrounded by screens displaying security footage and communication logs. His loyal staff worked frantically to compile the evidence they had gathered over the past 72 hours. "Sir, we've confirmed the transmission patterns," Lieutenant Santos reported, pointing to a complex data visualization. "The leaked classified information matches perfectly with Commander Brown's original findings 3 years ago." Garrett nodded grimly. "And the money trail?" "Offshore accounts, sir." Just like Tom suspected. "We've traced payments from known foreign intelligence fronts directly to General Matthews and his co-conspirators." On the main screen, security cameras showed military police units moving into position around base headquarters. Garrett picked up his secure phone and pressed a single button. "Execute," he commanded. Teams of armed security forces swept through the building's corridors. In the executive conference room, General Matthews and 3 other high-ranking officers were in the middle of their morning briefing when the doors burst open. "General Matthews, the lead security officer announced, "you and your associates are under arrest for treason, conspiracy to commit murder, and selling classified military secrets to foreign powers." Matthews lunged for his phone but froze when he saw Cass standing in the doorway, still in her flight suit, holding a tablet displaying damning evidence from her father's hidden files. "Looking for this?" she asked quietly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "My father made copies. He knew what you were doing." The general's face twisted with rage. "You're just like your father, too smart for your own good." "No," Admiral Garrett said, stepping into the room behind Cass. "She's exactly smart enough. Smart enough to find what her father hid, and brave enough to help us expose you." As the conspirators were led away in handcuffs, Garrett placed a protective hand on Cass's shoulder. "Your father would be proud," he said softly. "He gave his life to protect these secrets, and you finished what he started." In the following hours, the full scope of the conspiracy emerged. Commander Tom Brown had discovered evidence of classified technology being sold to foreign governments 3 years ago. When he threatened to expose the operation, Matthews and his co-conspirators arranged the accident that took his life. But Tom had been careful. He had hidden copies of his evidence in encrypted files, tucked away in the technical manuals and flight documents he left behind. The very materials Cass had been studying all these years. He knew someone would find them eventually, Garrett explained to the assembled press corps. His daughter's curiosity and dedication led her right to them, though she didn't realize their significance at first. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, communication logs, and classified documents created an airtight case against Matthews and his conspirators. The investigation revealed that they had been selling military secrets for years, compromising national security for personal profit. As the corrupt officials were led to waiting vehicles for transport to the military detention center, Cass stood watching, her father's ring glinting in the sunlight. Admiral Garrett joined her, his posture now relaxed for the first time in days. "Your father died protecting what was right," he said. "He could have looked the other way, taken their money, lived a comfortable life, but he chose honor instead." Cass nodded, her eyes fixed on the departing conspirators. "And now everyone knows the truth. He wasn't just another training accident, he was a hero." "Yes, he was," Garrett agreed, "and his daughter is every bit as brave and principled as he was." Military investigators continued to process the command center, gathering additional evidence that would ensure the conspirators faced the full weight of military justice. The charges were severe: treason, conspiracy, murder, and selling military secrets. Court-martial proceedings would begin within days. Justice had finally come for Tom Brown, delivered through the combined efforts of his daughter's determination and his old friend's loyalty. The corrupt officials who had betrayed their country and murdered a good man would answer for their crimes, their conspiracy exposed to the light of day. 3 months after the conspiracy's exposure, the military courtroom stood silent as the judge delivered the verdict. General Matthews and his co-conspirators sat rigid in their dress uniforms, their faces ashen as the sentences were read. For the charges of treason, conspiracy to commit murder, and selling classified military secrets, this court finds the defendants guilty on all counts. The judge's voice echoed through the chamber. The defendants are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Cass sat in the gallery between her mother and Admiral Garrett, her father's Naval Academy ring gleaming on the chain around her neck. She watched as the men responsible for her father's death were led away in handcuffs, their careers and freedom forfeit for their betrayal. After the proceedings, Admiral Garrett guided Cass and her mother to a private ceremony in the base commander's office. The Secretary of the Navy stood before a small gathering of high-ranking officers holding a polished wooden box. "Commander Thomas Brown exemplified the highest traditions of naval service," the Secretary began. "His sacrifice in defense of our nation's secrets and his unwavering integrity in the face of corruption deserve our highest recognition." He opened the box, revealing a Navy Cross, one of the service's highest decorations. "It is my honor to posthumously award Commander Brown the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism and uncommon valor in service to his country." Cass's mother accepted the medal with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. Cass stood tall beside her, her chin lifted proudly as her father's sacrifice was finally acknowledged. After the ceremony, Admiral Garrett led Cass to the flight line where a training aircraft waited. Over the past months, he had worked tirelessly to create a special mentorship program, focusing his energy on nurturing young talent rather than maintaining rigid authority. "Your father would want you to do this properly," Garrett said, his voice warm with affection. "No more learning from manuals in secret. From now on, you'll train the right way." He handed her a leather flight jacket, youth-sized but otherwise identical to the ones worn by qualified pilots. On the breast pocket, a patch read "Brown" in bold letters. "Really?" Cass asked, her eyes wide with wonder as she slipped on the jacket. Garrett nodded. "You've earned it. We've arranged a special training program that will prepare you for the Naval Academy. Physics, aerodynamics, leadership courses, everything you'll need to follow in your father's footsteps the right way." He patted the aircraft's fuselage. "And yes, proper flight instruction is included. Though I must say, your unauthorized self-study was remarkably thorough." Cass grinned, remembering how this had all started with her surprising demonstration in the F-22. "I had a good teacher," she said, touching her father's ring, "even if he didn't know he was teaching me." Later that afternoon, Garrett watched from the control tower as Cass completed her first official training flight. Her movements were precise, her radio communications crisp and professional. She had her father's natural talent, but now she would have the proper guidance to develop it safely. "She's a natural," the flight instructor reported over the radio, "just like her old man." Garrett smiled, remembering his own flying days with Tom. The rigid, by-the-book commander he had been just months ago seemed like a stranger now. In mentoring Cass, he had rediscovered the joy of nurturing young talent, of seeing the future of aviation through fresh eyes. That evening, Garrett joined Cass and her mother for dinner, a weekly tradition they had started since the conspiracy's exposure. The three of them had formed their own kind of family, bound together by their connection to Tom. "I got my preliminary acceptance today," Cass announced, pulling out an envelope bearing the Naval Academy's seal. "If I maintain my grades and complete the training program, I'll have a spot in the class of 2030. Her mother wiped happy tears from her eyes. "Your father would be so proud, sweetheart." "He would," Garrett agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "But not just because you're following his path. He'd be proud of the person you are. Brave, principled, determined to do what's right." Cass touched the ring that now hung properly on its chain, understanding its true significance. It wasn't just a memento of her father. It was a symbol of the values he had lived and died for, values she now carried forward. "I used to wear this to feel close to him," she said softly. "Now I wear it to remind me of what he stood for, what he believed in." Garrett nodded, seeing in her eyes the same unwavering integrity he had known in his friend. "That's the real legacy he left you, Cass. Not the flight manuals or the technical knowledge, but the courage to stand up for what's right no matter the cost." As they finished dinner, Garrett pulled out his calendar. "Your next training flight is scheduled for 0800 hours tomorrow. Ready to work on those landing patterns?" Cass's face lit up with determination. "Yes, sir." The hardened military commander, who had once dismissed the Future Aviators program as mere theater, was gone. In his place was a mentor dedicated to nurturing the next generation, finding purpose in guiding young talents like Cass toward their dreams. Together, they had transformed tragedy into triumph. Tom Brown's sacrifice had not only exposed corruption, but had also forged an unexpected bond between his daughter and his old friend. Through Cass, his legacy would live on, carried forward by the next generation of aviators who would serve with the same honor and integrity that had marked his life. Thanks